For many decades, in fact, almost a century, California was considered the golden state, the state that represented opportunity, going all the way back to the days of the gold rush when people moved westward looking for freedom, but also looking for a chance to make a better life. And all of that is now in the past. California is, quite honestly, no longer the golden state. And Texas appears to have taken that title. In fact, there's an article in Texas Monthly, and it's called The New Golden State. And I think in that sense, it is right on. Now, amazingly, the article kind of misunderstands its own premise because the editor, Dan Goodgame, he goes, why do so many still move here? And he goes on to say, wow, it's kind of a puzzle. He says, Texas is enacting all these controversial and unpopular laws like the abortion restriction law, restrictions on voting rights. This is the voter integrity bill. And he goes, and yet, people still want to come here. In other words, this is a liberal, and he says Texas has all these Republican policies, and he claims Republican policies that don't reflect the majority of Texas. Well, first of all, Texas has a Republican governor, Republican legislature, so he couldn't be more wrong about that. But nevertheless, his point is that he's sort of baffled by the appeal of Texas, which he then subsequently tries to explain. And let's before we get to the explanation, let's talk about some of the interesting facts about Texas. Texas's population in the last decade has grown by about 4 million. That's far more than any other state. If you look at these kind of lists that you see of like fastest growing cities in America, what do you see? You see Fort Worth, you see Austin, you see San Antonio. By the way, in the previous decade or so, Houston would have been consistently on that list. And then even smaller parts of Texas, places like Frisco and McKinney and New Braunfels are growing. And the question is, who's coming to Texas and why? Now, we think of people coming to Texas from California, and California is the largest feeder. It's the single biggest state from which people come to Texas, but it's not the only one. I found it very interesting that only about half of the people who come to Texas are even coming from the United States. A bunch of people are coming from other parts of the world, and the point being that when they come to America, they come to Texas. Why? Because they see Texas, I think, as reflecting an older America, or at least an America that still has open horizons, opportunity, where even working class guys can make a good living. And as you read this Texas Monthly article, you begin to see that, the reasons why people are coming is low regulation. In other words, there's a regulatory environment in which you can start a business. They quote entrepreneurs, including Elon Musk. And he says, listen, when I was in California, they just kept, quote, getting in the way. He says California needs to get out of the way of wealth creators and innovators. And that's what Texas does. They get out of the way. And so now Texas is home to apparently 50 Fortune 500 companies. Texas's GDP is $2 trillion. California is still number one. Texas is number two. But the trend is in favor of Texas and against California. So as the Texas Monthly article continues, you begin to realize that they interview people and they say things like, I came because I like the fact that Texas encourages oil and gas. I came because Texas has a low, kind of an easy regulatory environment. I came because I don't like state income taxes on top of the high federal taxes I already pay, and Texas has no state income tax. So as you go down the list, you begin to realize that contrary to what this foolish editor has been saying, it is precisely conservative and Republican policies for which people are coming. And in case you think that the appeal of Texas is somehow the appeal of, ethnic homogeneity or the way the world used to be in 1940, not at all. The single largest group in terms of percentages coming to Texas is, in fact, Asian Americans. Big surprise. Texas, of course, has more Hispanics than Asian Americans, but Hispanics are growing mainly through a higher Hispanic birth rate. Hispanics, in other words, have a higher birth rate than non-Hispanic whites, and so the Hispanic population is swelling, but for that reason. If you look at newcomers coming to Texas from the outside, the largest number is Asian Americans. So to give you an idea, 613,000 Asians came to Texas. Over 500,000 out of that number, out of that 4 million number that I mentioned earlier, 600,000 plus were Asian Americans. So Texas is becoming an ethnically diverse state. I think that's actually good. Texas has also become culturally more diverse. It's amazing to me when we first, Debbie's been in Texas, but when I moved here from California, I was really struck by the cosmopolitanism, not just of Houston, but also the suburbs of Texas. If you go to the suburbs of Dallas, the suburbs of Houston, you find that there is Afghan food, Persian food, Indian food. And so something that one might not expect, you might expect, well, you're going to get really good steak, really good barbecue, but not a whole lot else. And that is no longer true. I don't even know if it ever was true, but it is. But in Houston, there's now it's become a kind of culinary paradise. I think what I'm saying here is that Texas is a very livable state. I have to concede, if I had to pick the most beautiful state in the country in terms of natural beauty, I'd have to go with California, probably followed by maybe Colorado, maybe Virginia, maybe Utah and Wyoming. Texas wouldn't probably be at the top of that list. But in terms of the overall standard of living, just the everyday pleasantness of life in Texas, I've come to believe that Texas is rightfully number one.